Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Johnson. I'm really happy to be here speaking with you at the Role of Social Innovation in Democracy Conference, hosted by Stanford Social Innovation Review. Hats off to them for this great event. And I'm here to talk with you not about how democracies die. There's been a lot about that. Instead, I want to talk about how democracies innovate. There are good ideas developing. There are movements to advance those ideas. And it's coming together to meet the challenges of this moment, the challenges that face our country. I want to start off with a little bit of background. Again, my name is Kevin Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Election Reformers Network. We're an organization founded by election specialists in 2017, focused on modernizing the US democratic institutions that are threatened by polarization. Pieces of my background are on the slide here. I've also put in some of the covers of reports we've written, research reports on elements of the challenges facing US democracy, particularly regarding election administration, conflict of interest in election administration, other issues along those same lines. That picture is me at the very beginning of my involvement in elections, monitoring an African election 30 years ago. And also I want to point out this piece of legislation here is a constitutional amendment to establish a independent redistricting commission in New Mexico that we've been working hard to advance. And I'll say more about that in a minute. First, some framing of this talk. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes on the topic of innovation in democracy. And I want to emphasize that I'm focused on a fairly narrow definition of democracy here. Democracy obviously has a lot of really important resonance in terms of a system that establishes the principles of equal participation, equal rights, equal opportunity. But here my focus is much more on what you might even call the algorithm of democracy, how democracy works through a set of systems to translate public preferences into state policy. And if we all agreed, we wouldn't need the complicated mechanisms of voting. We would just agree and it would happen, but we don't. The public is divided, often conflictually divided over preferences. And so we need systems to translate public preferences into state policy. And there's a lot of different options about how those systems can be set up. And that's where the human propensity to innovate, the human kind of desire to tweak and make better comes through as we look for different ways to work on options about in these two areas here, how voting works, how votes translate into political power, and who manages, administers, and referees elections. So that's what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to say a bit about from a sort of a historical perspective, a bit from bring in some international angle, and then focus in on challenges that right now that are making innovation particularly important in the United States, and address and describe three innovations that have a lot to offer to help us meet those challenges. First, sort of historically, this is a kind of quick list of some pretty important innovations in history of democracy in both of those two categories. So here there's some of the how, the introduction of proportional representation in Australia in 1840. The first country to change the upper chamber from kind of aristocratically selected to popular election. That was the United States with the 17th Amendment. And there's also some of the who here. Independent election administration established in Canada in 1920, independent redistricting. I've arranged this sort of list to illustrate the concept of a kind of global democracy learning curve. Countries have been doing democracy at the national level beginning in the late 1700s. And more countries have been converting to democracy over the years. And this curve shows the total of that cumulative experience with democracy. And it's up to over 5,700 years now. And that's a lot of experience. We often in the US sort of think of democracy as kind of the American story. It's a world story. And it's that world experience is the source of the innovation that can allow us to meet challenges and continue to improve this incredibly important system. But it's not to say that innovation and democracy is, exactly parallel to technology innovation. Here, Steve Jobs can introduce a phone that can go from launch to global domination in a few short years. But innovation in democracy is a lot harder because changes in rules inevitably challenge the power of incumbents and elites. And that's a core factor that makes innovation more challenging. We can see in this graph here that factor of the kind of the way in which elites try to prevent and block change. This is a graph looking at the very slow adoption of women's suffrage from the first state passing it in 1869 until it finally was ratified by constitutional amendment in 1919, a 50-year period. Other rules get adopted more quickly. This chart looks at the adoption of the Australian secret ballot, which was an innovation to have the government print all of the candidates on one piece of paper that people would try and check off their candidate. Previous to that, parties printed their own ballot, and all the different party agents would give ballots to the different voters. And that was a system that was vulnerable to all sorts of fraud. So this was an important innovation to go to the Australian ballot. Innovation can be restricted by things like the resistance of elites. There are also some important democracy enablers to talk about. One of them is political crises. Pictured here is Canada's nonpartisan chief electoral officer. He runs federal elections in Canada, and by law, the person filling this position is not allowed to vote. And likewise, his counterparts at the provincial level, Canada's provincial chief election officers, most of them are also not allowed to vote. And that law kind of symbolizes the nonpartisanship of these positions, the dedication that these positions will be held by professionals who are separate from the political fray. And that came about as a response to elections in Canada in 1917, where there was widespread fraud, so much so that it was a foregone conclusion that the political party in charge in Parliament would win because they could control the rules. And that led political elites to recognize they needed to separate election management away from political control and create independent election administration. Another important sort of enabler of innovation has been learning from others. The chart here looks at the spread of independent redistricting since it began in 1887 all the way through recent passage in France. And we'll touch on states in the US who have begun to implement this reform. We benchmark ourselves as humans. We understand what other countries are doing and we want to keep up with them. And so that factor is an important additional enabler of innovation and democracy. And the third to mention is the grassroots. There's a Where's Waldo picture. I'm in that picture somewhere, advocating before the Massachusetts State House. The grassroots is increasingly important counter to that elite resistance that's having more and more impact in terms of getting innovations passed. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in this next chart, which looks at an area where the US has really led the pace globally in innovation, which is ways to make voting more convenient, which is particularly important in the United States, given that, unlike other countries, we don't set the day aside as a national holiday. This chart shows the increase in US voters that are voting early or by mail, taking advantage of those convenience options. We are now second in the world behind Switzerland in that category. And likewise, there have been a range of other innovations adopted or reforms that have adopted that have helped voting become more convenient and voter registration become more convenient. This chart looks at 5 different reforms in those categories, how much they were in use in the States in 2000 compared to 2021, and you can see a pretty significant expansion. Voting and registration have gotten easier in the United States. A lot of that has to do with that grassroots mobilization that I mentioned earlier. All that said, it's important to recognize that democracy innovation is particularly hard in the United States. And that has to do with what we might call first mover disadvantage. We set up difficult to change rules at the very beginning of the world sort of learning curve about democracy. And we did so in a constitution that's about one of the most difficult to amend in the United States. And the decisions made were made before there was really a full understanding of how democracy works in practice. In particular, the founders did not understand political parties and the way that parties are fundamental and inevitable. They hoped that they expected that they could keep factions, as they called them, outside of the institutions. And so they didn't kind of put in place structures that worked with parties. And that has kind of had a distorting effect on our democracy ever since, because parties absolutely cannot be kept out of democracy. Um, Another important reason why innovation has been hard in the United States is the impact of slavery. All of US democratic institutions effectively grew up under this distorted influence of the South needing to protect slavery and later maintain segregation. That shows up in all sorts of ways. One of the continuing ways you see it a lot is this bias toward the belief that states really should dominate controlling elections. Our Constitution does not say that. The Constitution makes clear that, at least in terms of elections for Congress, Congress itself has the greater authority to set the time, place, and manner for elections. But when national standards are proposed, there is always the pushback that says, traditionally, we are state-run in our elections. Well, that tradition is really one that echoes the impact of slavery. So these things continue to be impediments that are particular to the United States. And an important reason to talk about all this is that we really need innovation now. This is the democracy dying kind of element. There is a doom loop of polarization that is threatening our democracy. A lot of folks have written great pieces about this. What this draws on those studies to a certain extent. But what I want to talk about here is, first, the way in which our parties have, the divide between our parties has purified and created kind of essentially an existential divide between them. And that came about from defections of Southern conservatives from the Democratic Party and of Northern liberals from the Republican Party following the Civil Rights era. Before that time, there was enough ideological overlap that it was relatively easy to get things done, get laws passed, find compromise, all of which is essential in our form of legislation, in our system. But with that polarization, with that purification, we now have two warring camps that increasingly just see the benefit of beating each other and not compromising. A second sort of element of this doom loop is the change in the media environment. Innovation or new business models, new media platforms that really have profited from selling tribal anger, that reward extremists, that spread disinformation. And those new media platforms have done a lot to intensify the polarization already arising from the two-party divide. And then these run into the problem that we have outdated election rules. We have a voting method called a simple plurality voting method that really can empower extremes. It means that in a crowded election, the candidate who has the most votes, even if that's way short of the majority, will win. We also have primaries, which are low turnout, that and also favor the extremes or tend to empower extremes. So there are a number of our voting rules that play into this cycle here of polarization. And we also have management systems that allow parties to control redistricting, control election rules, and all of that sort of threatens our fair and trusted elections. So this is a dynamic we have to figure out how to stop, and it's changing the outdated rules on this right side that is the most important, and that's where innovation comes in. I'm going to talk about three innovations in particular now: independent redistricting, impartial election administration, and ranked choice voting, particularly as it's been applied in Alaska with a reform of the primary system. These things combine to reduce party control over elections and reduce incentives for extremism. There are other important innovations as well. Certainly, we need work on campaign finance reform. The winner-take-all structure of the Electoral College is a problem that continues to disrupt and diminish our democracy. But I want to focus right now on these three, which have a lot of momentum and a lot of opportunity to address our current problems. So starting with redistricting, most states have redistricting where the political majority in the legislature effectively has control. That legislative controlled redistricting creates a conflict of interest between the legislators' sort of duty to the electorate and their self-interest to help their party win, to help themselves have safe districts. There's been a lot of fraud and bribery that's come about around redistricting because getting the district you want is such a valuable thing for a legislator. Partisan controlled redistricting results in less competitive districts, which in turn empowers the extremes. And as this chart shows on the right, redistricting, party-dominated redistricting can create a situation where the party that wins does in fact get control of the legislature. There are 3 years illustrated here in the chart where the Democratic vote share in these 3 states was more than 50%, but they were in the minority because their seat share, because of redistricting, was less than the majority. There's been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of innovation. In particular, the concept of the Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission has made a lot of difference. This chart talks about the slow but important progress toward redistricting fully controlled by an independent commission, which is that top bar, that's growing bar on the top. There are other versions of support to redistricting where an advisory or bipartisan commission plays a role. Those help, but the thing that we really need to do is in effect graduate those states to states that do fully independent redistricting. And the other thing that's important to say about all this is that although the next census isn't until 2030, the time is now to push in state legislatures and even federally for reform, because now states don't know who's going to be in charge. And now is the time to take advantage of not knowing whether you're going to benefit or not, and push through these reforms. The next reform to talk about is reforming partisan election administration. The problem here is that most of our election officials have close ties to a political party. They do a great job even so, but it's awful. It's particularly confusing for voters and always a potential source of manipulation that election officials have these party loyalties. Partisan zealots try to get in, and recently have really intensely tried to get into and control elections. The solution, structural reform to put independent professionals in charge, and ethics reform to ensure impartiality. And then the last of the 3 to talk about is ranked choice voting, particularly as applied to a combination of both the primary and the general. Pictured here is Alaska's first ranked choice ballot, and you can see the first choice, second choice, third choice there, giving voters their opportunity to not just pick one, but rank their preference, and the tabulation system uses those preferences to arrive at a winner who has majority support. In the Alaskan version, there is a primary, one primary for all parties. All candidates are on that primary. Voters pick one at that level, and then the top 4 or 5 candidates pass through to the general election, and that's the level that's decided by ranked choice voting. This has a big potential impact because extremist candidates do much less well in this voting system because candidates really need to appeal beyond their base to win. So this has a great the potential to really reduce the degree to which the people representing us are beholden to the most combative and extreme polarized parts of our political dynamic, and as a contrast to bring people together who are able and ready to compromise. There's a sort of a question, well, why be optimistic about these reforms? This slide shows the results of ballot initiatives in 2018 with a breakdown on how the vote went in counties where Trump won by 25 points or more in 2016. And as you can see, independent redistricting in several states had very strong support, even in those counties. And another reason for optimism is the polling that shows strong bipartisan support for these reforms. On the left is a poll that we did at Election Reformers Network. It shows a lot of data supporting impartial election administration. We asked how important it is that election officials act in an impartial manner. Huge majorities say it's very important, and that's true across all the political affiliations. Likewise, here's an Economist poll that shows nearly 2/3 of voters support giving control over map-making powers to independent commissions. So that sort of summarizes the range of innovations I wanted to talk about. You can contact me with your feedback or request for the PowerPoint deck at my email address here, kjohnsonelectionreformers.org. You can check us out. And I'll leave in saying we are big believers that this country is ready for neutral referees to call balls and strikes. That's what this man is doing here. We believe that we are ready to transition to having that kind of independence in charge of these critical functions that are so important to our democracy. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.